welcome each and every one of you to the first panel, Animal Cognition, Consciousness, Sentience, and Ethics of the Jane Goodall Leadership Legacy program, hosted by the Parliament of the World's Religions. As a key part of the Women's Leadership, Global and Grassroots Pathways for Collective Impact series. I imagine Jane would say from where she is now that we are all here together for a reason. Perhaps some of you connecting later, separated in time if you're watching the recording. But we are all here celebrating Jane's leadership legacy together for a reason. We may not know all the reasons now, but as we go through our lives, those reasons will unfold. If only we pay attention, close attention to what the universe abundantly offers and is freely giving all the time. If only we know how to tune in and receive fully from the universe. So I invite all of you to arrive and find the present moment. If it helps, you may close your eyes or lower them and connect to the space within you, the expansive and open space within you, where there is no barrier, no separation, no division. There is no us and no them, where in this space, everything that there is in the universe exists. And to feel the presence of Jane, to truly feel the presence of Jane in that field of love where she has planted innumerable seeds as she traveled all around the world, taking with her deep inside the peace from the forest. And to this space, I want to invite our panelists, Mark Beckhoff, Kristen Andrews, Lisa Jones-Angel, and Joyce De Silva. And our weaver, Christy Dutman, who will hopefully join us soon. All these panelists, Mark, if you can just wave, Mark, Christine, Lisa, and Joyce, in their own way, each one of them have challenged the status quo in how we understand, how we relate to, and how we treat non-human animals. And in doing so, I believe they have also illuminated what it is to truly be a human in this interconnected web of life. And all of them have been guided by empathy, compassion, and a clear purpose, a perfect clarity in why they're doing what they're doing. And just the way Jane had this clear purpose in her life. And she has often attributed her formative years for how her love for animals was nourished and encouraged by her mother and supported in every possible way. And so with that, Mark, I would love to ask you whether there were some formative memories or something that led you to study animals and study ethology and the behavior of animals, and how in this journey of yours, how you crossed paths with Jane.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just started studying animals when I was 2 and 3 years old, growing up on the concrete sidewalks of Brooklyn, New York. I would watch them, and I would always ask my folks what they were thinking and feeling.
Hmm.
Um, I guess in a sense, I was minding them. And I wrote a book called Minding Animals in 2002 that meant that I was attributing minds to them and also minding them in the sense of caring for them. So that was just really part of, I guess, who it was. And, Jane and I talked countless times about the importance of our mothers because I
Hmm.
don't think my parents understood very much what I was doing, but they supported it. And my mother was very empathic, and my father was just a 100% optimist on things. And I think so I benefited from both of those contributions. And that's just what I decided to do. I mean, my path to ultimately doing what I've been doing for a long time was not nonlinear for sure. Um, and then I knew of Jane's work for quite a while, and her husband, at the time, Hugo van Leeuwenhoek, the National Geographic photographer, used to stay with me when he was in the States. So even, people forget that there was a time before there was internet and chatting and texts and
Yeah.
email. Even faxing was kind of on the technological future looking um, venue. But I guess I met Jane at some meetings. We connected when she was in Boulder. It turned out we had a common friend here, and I didn't know that. And I was finishing the first edition of the Encyclopedia of Animal Rights and Animal Welfare. So I contacted her and asked if she would write the foreword, and she wrote back and said, "And I'll be in Boulder, and I stay at so and so's house, who just happened to be a good friend of mine." So that was probably, I don't know, 1997 or so, I
Oh, wow.
suppose. Yeah, maybe 28 years ago. Um, but we really hit it off. She had time in Boulder, and that was really the beginning of it all, I suppose, in terms of having a lot of contact with her. And when was it? I guess at the turn of the century, which is a frightening thought, from 1999 to 2000. I wrote up this piece called the 12 Mantras, um, and Jane joined in. We published it, and then I don't remember where we were. We were traveling together somewhere, and I just suggested maybe we do a book based on that, and she was really open to it.
Is
And
this
that's
the
what,
one, the 10 trusts? Or,
yeah, so the 10 trusts
okay, for
emerged
those
from
who have
that.
not seen.
Um, and then I was always interested in early childhood education. So I jumped on board with her Roots and Shoots program
Yeah.
and started traveling all over. When I was traveling alone and with Jane, helping to form groups, basically. Um, and I mean, that was pretty much it. I mean, we spent a lot of time together. She wasn't on email when we started writing the 10 trusts. I said, Jane, you need to get on email. I would, because of our time difference, depending where she was, I'd go to sleep, send her something. It would be morning if she was in the UK or Europe or even in East Africa. And then I'd get something faxed to me. Um, and the other side of Jane, we did a book for her called Jane Goodall at 90. And it was a collection of 90 essays. We called them 90 Candles. And we had done one called The Jane Effect when she turned 80 as well. And in that era, if you will, she got on email, and we could actually email one another. Um, so, I mean, all in all, she was an outstanding scientist. People sometimes criticized her science because she named animals and she attributed personalities to them. And people at Cambridge said, we don't do that. And I don't know what Jane actually said, but obviously she did that. And, um, she was a great scientist. Her book, The Chimpanzees of Gombe, published in 1986, is as detailed an analysis of chimpanzee behavior that has ever been published. And the other thing that people did not realize was her great sense of humor. And she actually wrote about that in different places. There was an article in The Guardian a few years ago that basically said, where she was lamenting that people didn't know she had a great sense of humor. And so some of her texts, well, I know, see, I call them texts. They were faxes.
Yeah.
um, would always be funny. And one, I was looking for it, but you wouldn't see it anyway, was we were deep into the 10 trust. We were waiting for proofs, and she started one of her faxes. Oh dear, it's her again. Sorry. And we also shared a strong liking for PT single malt scotch. She called it her cough medicine. And we just spent a lot of time. We traveled together all over, and Tom Mangelson, or Images of Nature Photography. He's one of the world's greatest photographers. He's won many awards. Used to meet at his cabin in Nebraska for kind of a debriefing. And we had some meetings on Whidbey Island at the Whidbey Institute in Washington. Just some very small gatherings, discussing roots and shoots and just different programs. And yeah, we have a young kids book coming out in
Yeah.
February of 2027. I'd love to.
Yeah, I think we will come to it in our
Okay,
third panel, uh,
good.
because that would be
Cool.
wonderful to hear more about it.
I
So
can't
this
tell you
is,
more about it.
thank you so much for thank you so much for bringing Jane alive to all of us. Like we felt like, we just met her just now and we are part of this small gathering that you're talking about. Thank you so much for sharing that. And um, yeah. And your work has been immense. Like, I don't know how many books have you written. I think more than 30, and on different animals and animal behaviors. And I have read many of your articles that you've written about all sorts of interesting questions. And we'll come back to it in a bit. So I was just wondering, Kristen, uh, do you have some stories to share, also some childhood memories or something that was formative for you?
Yeah, the I know Jane often told the story about the chickens and watching chickens lay eggs. My
Yeah.
mom tells me that the first animals I was obsessed about were frogs, and that I don't even remember this, but that when I was a toddler, I would go into our backyard in Nashville, Tennessee, and find little baby frogs and collect them in my hand, and then go to show her. But sadly, I didn't have enough control to keep them safe. So I've gotten better as I've
Yeah.
aged. And yeah, I spent a lot of time outdoors wherever we lived. We moved around a lot. We were living in California, and a cat named Seedwee, who we named Seedwee, adopted us. My mother fed the cat milk and bananas, and the milk went over better than the bananas. And then in Indiana, I would again collect frogs and toads and crayfish and try to understand things from their perspective. And this was something that I saw throughout my life. My parents were always very supportive of it. So supportive that when I wanted to go to Hawaii for a year after university and study dolphin mines, they financed that, which was very generous of them after 4 years of a US college education.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really do think that these kind of early exposures to being with animals, engaging with them, minding them in the way that Mark described, was incredibly influential to all of the scholarship I've done since then as a philosopher. Yeah.
So how was it that you decided to study philosophy? Because you could have chosen science, right? So what
Hmm.
was it in philosophy that attracted you?
Well, in philosophy, we kept asking questions about the nature of mind, memory, morality, and it were these sorts of social questions that I was always interested in. And I thought that we could learn about how to live a good life by looking at other animals. because I had learned so much from watching animals as a child. That is why I wanted to go to Hawaii. I thought the dolphins might be able to give me a different perspective on philosophical questions
Wow.
about the meaning of life, and about how to organize yourself socially. I think that we can learn a lot when we look at the different styles of sociality that we see in different species. Um, and
Yeah.
yeah, those are all philosophical questions. As it turns out, philosophy and science are very tightly connected, and I've been doing science and doing philosophy and doing a little bit of policy throughout my career, and very lucky to be able to combine things in that way. I mean, I think Jane also was doing philosophy and science and policy. And those of us who are working in an area where things really matter, I think we can't help but think about like what these concepts mean, what are the ethical, what's the ethical import of the work we're doing, and we can't help but ask questions about the world and what's going on in the minds and behaviors of the other organisms we share the planet with.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that's part of the thing that, like, I think all of you are working on the edge where, like, boundaries, like, you can really shine light, because if you're deep inside a field, you're kind of stuck. Like, you have to move to the edges of the fields and to be able to really make progress and challenge the status quo. That's where all that happens. And it's amazing that all of you have managed to integrate activism in your whatever you're doing, science, philosophy, and as you said, to really truly answer lots of questions. There is really no separation between disciplines, right?
Mm.
And yeah, so I that's wonderful, and I think maybe at some point we'll come back to like understanding a little bit more about the normative behaviors and the social things that you have discovered.
Yeah, but this point about working on the edges of disciplines, I think, is also something that Jane demonstrated for us. She
Exactly.
says many times that Louis Leakey selected her to work in Gombe and work with the chimpanzees because she hadn't been trained in all the bad ways of thinking, and that she would come with a perspective, which was the kind of perspective he wanted, one that came from anthropology and thinking about social relationships as opposed to thinking about inputs and outputs and animals just as little machines.
Right.
So,
Yeah, the empathy was such an important part of how she studied. And that was the one thing that, as Mark said, was criticized. But I think that's part mark of a true compassionate leadership is like if you have a clarity of purpose, all these naysayers and people who are constantly saying, oh no, this is not the way to do things, you just listen to them and just keep doing what needs to be done, right? And she actually made it very clear that the empathy was in fact needed, not just that it was a barrier. It was what led her to what she all of the discoveries that she made. And so
right.
it was so crucial for her, right, to
Yeah, I mean,
name
imagine trying to
them.
study a human child without giving that kind of empathy. How little would you learn about that child if you didn't treat them as a minded agent with a personality and
Yeah,
care and concern?
right.
I write about this in my little book, How to Study Animal Minds, and draw upon Jane's teaching and show how it's really integrated itself into comparative psychology, where now people, the scientists, are realizing the importance of forming relationships with animals, and not just chimpanzees, but any of the animals that you're working with. If you want to really know what they're doing, you have to recognize that they are in relationship with whoever they're interacting with. And if that's you, the human
Yeah,
experimenter, that matters. That is a variable in your science.
yeah. Thank you. And I think Lisa, probably you're like nodding all the time and you're listening to Mark and to Christine. And do you want to share how was it for you? Was it also like some childhood memories or something? And I know you've written that you were inspired by the primates, and I just want
Ex-
to actually take a moment before we move on to if you could just say like how you got interested and also take a moment to pay homage to Birute Galdikas, who just recently passed away. She was the last of the primates who studied the around the same time. We're all guided by Leakey. And
Right.
just if you could say a few words
Sure.
about all this, that would be amazing.
You know, it's Jane and Brute and Diane Fossey. They would come into my living room on Sunday nights. It's via the TV. And this was, I was raised as an only child, and so all types of animals were my best friends. But the Sunday nights when the shows would come on, the Wild Kingdom, the Nat Geo specials, these women and these extraordinary animals would be there. And I would, it was a ritual for us, truly a ritual to sit down and just watch them and absorb these women who I would sit there in awe. I was just, and I would think, how can I be? I want to be you.
Wow.
And I saw a Jane Goodall film in 4th grade in Mrs. Alexander's class in very rural Maryland. And I will never, ever forget that moment. Again, just, I can still hear the film reel clicking around. This was back in the day when watching something, just the sound of the machine also became embedded in the way that we experience it. And then a few years later, again, long before internet, or even, I don't even think they had faxes back in the early 80s, maybe. I hand wrote letters to National Geographic, the magazine, to Smithsonian, where I had seen these women. I'd seen the apes with them. And I said, I'm a high school junior. I want to go, I want to learn from these women. And they sent me the names and addresses of Jane and Diane and Brute. And I wrote to them.
Wow.
And Jane responded, a few years prior, she had some of her students at Gombe had actually been kidnapped. And so she was very hesitant about having anyone come and join her. Brute wrote back and saying, pending an interview and some more information, she would accept me and I was 17 at that time, as a field assistant in Kalimantan. She was actually coming to DC to meet with Jane and Diane. They had a big meeting. This was in 82, I think. No, 83. And then she came out to my home. And the next thing I knew, I was on a plane. I had never left the east coast of the US to Borneo. And I spent the next 8 months living with the orangutans, living with macaques, the kind of the antithesis of a great ape. The macaques were much smaller. They weren't as brightly colored.
Right.
But it was that line in the sand that Jane and Brute and Diane drew, which said that you must understand that these animals have cognitive and emotional lives, that you can't view them, you can't be with them, you certainly can't study them without understanding that. And that defined my career from that moment going forward. Ironically, Jane and I next crossed paths in a chimpanzee laboratory in upstate New York, the Laboratory for Experimental Medicine, Surgery, and Primates. And then, so at that point, I went and I spent years with one foot in sanctuaries, one foot in the laboratories. But Jane was always present. Jane was always someone I knew I could rely on. So a few years later, actually, not a few years, what am I saying? Decades later.
It seemed like a few years to you. Probably.
It seemed like a few years.
Right.
Because again, the impact that someone like Jane can have on a person and on a career, it was like having conversations with her. You're right, Bark. She finally got on email, so we could email back and forth.
Yeah.
But when it came time, when we needed people to speak up for the macaques, a much smaller, not nearly as bold and bright and charismatic, unfortunately, primate, Jane was there for them, as was Brute. They always understood that their apes may have been the kind of like the gateway for the world to understand primates, for the primates to come into our living rooms, into our lives. But they knew that every primate, every animal were beings that we must connect with on a critical level in order to be who we are, and also to do the science that we were doing. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, wonderful. And macaques, I mean, I grew up in India. So for me, those are the ones I grew up with literally. I mean, I used to go
Yes.
to the village and see them. And so I think a lot of people, that's the difference, right? Macaques,
Okay.
I think they're more accessible. I mean, you don't need to go to any jungles.
Right.
And a lot of people see them, at least if you grow up in those countries where they're everywhere. And so, and there are so many interactions that are all the time happening with those animals, like without being in a forest in a city.
Yeah.
And so that aspect, probably, how did that, like the ones when you were studying specifically in the forests, or you were also going to cities? And maybe can we have the second slide?
What you can see is that's a mom with a mom. You don't see my twin daughters were also there. So we're in Bangladesh right now.
Oh, wow.
And I led a large international research team for decades that looked at how diseases move back and forth between humans and primates throughout Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And my twin daughters started coming with me since they were 3. And so they were always present in the field with us. And that animal, the macaque you saw right there, she was a mom. Her infant, actually, she had a 1-year-old, so she didn't have a new one, but she was pregnant, and she was a little slow in waking up from her anesthesia. And so I just had her on my lap, just kind of as I would have had one of my twin daughters on my lap when they were that size.
Yeah.
There is no difference for a mother, I think. Whether you're holding another primate, whether you're holding a kitten, any another being, your hands, they tell the same story. I mean, that kicks in, that desire to comfort. She was having a little bit of difficulty waking up from her anesthetic, and so I mean, it was me just kind of like, come on, sweetheart, wake up, move your arms a little bit. It's time to move on here, and that's what Jane and Brute and Diane did for us. They let us know that there was no difference, that we needed to treat them and engage with them the same way that we would engage with our own family, our own friends, our own children. And I think that, and as you said, because macaques are so ubiquitous, not nearly as much as they were 30 or 40 years ago, and that's a different story. But because people see them every day, and you just get absorbed by them, you watch their antics. Macaques are fabulous. I think maybe even, I mean, I love the apes. I do. I love my orangutans. I hand reared, chimps from the lab, but a macaque is a being who is so intent upon having relationships with other macaques and these big, large social groups that it's a hoot just to be in there with them and to watch everything that they do. And people who are not scientists, people who simply are going to the temples in Asia, who are moving throughout the villages, the cities, they see that too. And you're drawn into them. So I love them for that.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is, I just feel like, I took out all the animals because for Jane, she was always carrying this childhood chimpanzee with her, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, oh, I need to have like some of the animals here to just connect. And children intuitively feel such huge connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they're given these toys. And then they are taught to forget
Yeah.
sometimes. And so it was so important that you all emphasized how your childhood was really very formative, and you were encouraged and supported in your connection with animals. And yeah, that's really important, I think. And your story is, and so how was it? Just I was just wondering, how did the transition happen from the forest? Because in the forest you were studying, just like long-term studies, observations, just the way the primates were doing. And how did you switch to doing experiments in labs?
If you are a primate scientist, a primatologist, and you're working in the US, again, back in we're four and a half decades ago, really the only path forward was to look at captive primates, and that meant primates in the lab. And so for me, that was that path that, Brute actually gave me a letter of introduction for Cornell, because Diane Fossey was teaching at Cornell. And the plan had been that I was going to go study under Diane. And I was probably headed towards mountain gorillas at that point. But then Diane was killed. And so at university, I at that point, the path that it was open was into studying primates in captivity. And that led me to 3 decades as a primate scientist, a biomedical scientist, working in the National Primate Research Centers, working in the Laboratory for Experimental Medicine and Surgery in Primates. That name it's a bad name, and it was not a good place if you're a primate. One of the extraordinary things that Jane did, though, and one of the first of its kinds things that happened at LEMCEP, was that LEMCEP opens its doors to Jane. So that time, Jim Mahoney was the veterinarian director. And Jim was a fabulous Irish scientist. He and Jane got on fabulously. Their love of Scotch was also right there. And Jim opened the lab to Jane. And Jane came in. And that had never been done before. One, a lab had never opened its doors for anyone from the outside to see. But imagine what it took to open your doors to Jane Goodall.
Yeah.
To open the door to the rooms where chimpanzees that she knew the grandfathers, the aunties, the uncles, the nieces, the nephews of those wild-caught chimpanzees. She would have known those animals. And she walked into those rooms. And this was devastating for her. I was there. It was profoundly devastating. But Jane also knew that you had to be present and working where the animals were. And so she turned her focus to, how do we get these chimpanzees out of the labs? How do we get people to see into the labs? How do we get people to care about these animals there? And how do we get them out? And that was Jane's gift to chimps. Jane's star power sounds trite, but Jane brought a focus of the world and also the scientific community on the chimpanzees that led to us ending the use of chimps more than a decade ago. That would not have happened without her. I'm convinced of that. Ultimately, the scientific community said, well, it's because the chimps weren't giving us the kind of answers that we needed. That is absolutely true. Relying upon chimps did not work. But it was having Jane Goodall by their side, having Jane Goodall sitting with people like Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, and saying, hey, these are who these animals are. You cannot separate, you can't just think that there's some living petri dish that you get to use. You have to understand the whole animal. And by doing that, she brought a scientific reckoning. And that reckoning continues today with the macaques, who unfortunately the scientific community turned to and really doubled down once the door was closed on the chimps.
Yeah. So actually, so Jane was there, like as you said, to kind of get the endangered species thing, right? Like recognized.
Right.
But then, like I read that they were trying to criticize, later try to take it down. The biomedical industry was not very happy with that, right?
No.
And it was like they were trying to take back this thing,
Oh,
and that's where like this thing, like the activists, like they were trying to kind of portray it as this activist, animal activists are the ones who are just making a fuss about nothing, right? Is what I gathered from reading at least several articles. That And so there was this thing, like it's very conveniently switched off. Like an activist suddenly becomes like I there was an article which was saying tented scientists. So what was
right.
the tent on them is what did they do? Is that they cared,
Right.
right?
Exactly. And I think that, Jane also did that. She opened up the pathway forward for people to understand that you can be scientists. We are all scientists on this
Right,
panel. Um, but we're also all activists. And it's not actually, I shouldn't even say but. We are scientists and we are
and
activists.
activists, right?
And that has been that was difficult for the world to even contemplate that. The idea that you could use your science to inform your activism. And I think that's one of the real strengths that Jane had,
Yeah,
that she showed it's not either or. It is, once you are responsible for an animal, once you know that animal, that species more than anyone else on this planet, then it is your job then it is your job to use your science, to use your writing, to use your speaking ability, to use your platform to make change happen, so that the world, the scientific community, the public understand that we don't. Let me back up. Let's go back to LEMSEP, that lab with my mentor, Jim Mahoney. Jim said to me, if you're going to be using animals in biomedical experimentation, two things must exist. One, the animal welfare must be the absolute best that it can be. The conditions that those animals experience have to be the best. And two, the science must be impeccable. And again, this is coming from a man who sits hand in hand with Jane Goodall, who understands science, who really understands animals. And by saying those two things, welfare must be the best, science is impeccable, what the scientific community and the activist community has understood is that that's not happening with animal experimentation. Jane knew that.
right.
Jim came further along in his career and identified that. For me, it took me a little bit longer to get there. But once you were there, it's I feel like I got Jane and Brute kind of riding on my shoulders here, saying, you know the animals, we taught you the animals. You taught yourself the science. It's your job now to make sure the rest of the world understands that. And we wouldn't have that without these women who blaze this path for us.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have heard people refer to you as the Jane Goodall of the macaques. And I know I think, I think like it's kind of to show that you are dedicated, as Jane was dedicated to chimpanzees and later to all animals. And that dedication is what is needed, as you said. Like, the boundaries just disappear once you have a clarity of purpose of why you're doing something. The why is the thing that I think
Yeah.
sometimes, like, that is lost in the like you get into all this thing in academia sometimes, and then like you lose the why sometimes. And if you lose that why, then it becomes hard, probably, because then you've drawn a barrier, right?
Right.
And but the thing is, once if you're not that and you're connected to the true reason why you're doing something and why you came, like you all came from love of animals and that connection that you felt, right? So once that's there, you're not going to sit there thinking, oh, is this good for my career, or what are others going to think? You just do it. And
Yeah.
that requires a lot of courage, and you've all shown that courage. And that's it's, I mean, like now this Oregon National Primate Research Center is going to close down, and that's a
It,
it's a big achievement, right? I mean, it's all everywhere in the news, and there are so many
it's a
organizations who are supporting that, and PETA was like really played an important role there, right?
certainly, and and one of the so right, we are at that cusp, for both the scientific community, which is advancing in its focus on non-animal methods. The funding community is advancing. The public and the scientists are realizing we have spent decades and decades and hundreds of thousands of primate lives have been literally ground up to try to improve human health. And finally, the science has caught up with where we need to go. And what we're seeing is now the oldest national primate research center in the US and the biggest is now in negotiations with the biggest funders saying, okay, we're ready to stop. We're ready to transition our facility to a sanctuary.
Yeah.
Jane was interviewed while kind of all this was before that we even got to this point. And, and she said, she was asked, what would you say about this? And I think she just gave a one-word answer, stop it. It was 2 words, stop it.
Yeah.
And, when someone like Jane, who has that platform, says, stop it, you pay attention. And I think that is the power that she had, and that all the primates had, and that we've collectively now, it's there's never going to be another Jane Goodall. There's never going to be another Brute, another Diane Fossey. Those women stood as single pillars of incredible power and light and just kind of flashing out there. But what it means now is that it does take this collective. It takes a lot of us to equal one of them, and we've got that now, and I'm that brings me joy because I see change. I'm sorry that I'm deeply sorry that Jane and Brute didn't get to see what's happening right now, didn't get to see what's going to happen in a few months, because the change that they ignited in all of us is now paying off, and it's the animals that they've championed throughout their careers will find a way out of these cages and back to where they belong, which is in the villages, the forests, Asia and Africa. And it's I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Just maybe take a moment to pause and feel the gratitude for all that the primates have done as pioneers. They were like the pioneer species. But like I think everything that comes later is as important. And yes, I think like your work, Lisa, or what Christine is doing and what Mark is doing, and we'll soon come to what Joyce has been doing. I mean, all this matters. Every single thing, like, it's really important what you all have done and how you have integrated all these different things and not drawn boundaries between how you do your work. And I'm really grateful to all of you for what you've been doing. So, Kristen, I just wanted to invite you to this conversation in terms of the personhood for chimpanzees, right? Like the non-human rights project. That was very important. I mean, Jane was a board member on that, and could you share a little bit how philosophers did their bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so ending the research and biomedical research on chimpanzees was a great first step. But in the US, chimpanzees are still legally considered objects, things, along with every other non-human animal. So in the law, there are persons and there are things. Humans are the only persons. This means you can buy and sell animals, right? You can buy and sell a chimpanzee as well as a dog. And the Non-Human Rights Project is an organization founded by the late Stephen Wise, who's an animal rights lawyer. And he dedicated his life to try to get legal personhood status for non-human animals, starting with chimpanzees. And he asked philosophers to get involved because of our tradition of conceptual analysis, making arguments about what a person is, what qualifies as a person, and also those philosophers like me who are also involved in the science and knew a lot about chimpanzee cognitive capacities. And so we were asked to write an amicus brief, and a group of, it was like about 15 philosophers co-authored an amicus brief for one of these cases, trying to get a writ of habeas corpus for two chimpanzees who were being kept in captivity. One was in somebody's garage, being kept in a cage in a garage. And as you might imagine, when you get 15 philosophers together to write something, it kind of expands. And it was too long for the amicus brief, so we had to cut it down into something much shorter. But as it turned out, I went to my editor at Routledge and said, would you be interested in publishing a book about chimpanzee rights and chimpanzee personhood? And he said, yes, I would. And so we worked together and turned this into a book where we looked at the arguments that the justices had made in their decision not to grant personhood rights to chimpanzees, and one by one rebutted all of those arguments. And then also created an independent standalone argument for why chimpanzees should be considered persons. And so this is a little book called Chimpanzee Rights, the Personhood brief, or the philosopher's brief. And this was something that we did. We invited Jane to write the introduction to that book. She was too busy to do it, but we were very lucky to have Laurie Gruen write the introduction to the book as well. Another wonderful philosopher, activist who's worked very hard to bring attention to the personalities and individual nature of all the chimpanzees who have been used in research in the United States. She's worked very hard to support sanctuaries and the development of sanctuaries in the US as well. And really so I never really met a chimpanzee. I met orangutans. I also worked in Borneo, Lisa. I also worked with, I was in East Kalimantan in sanctuary with Anne Russin, and also in the field in Kutai National Park. And once you've seen a great ape, and seen communities of great apes, and also helped to raise baby orangutans, there's just no question in my mind that these are persons who deserve all of the legal rights of human persons. It doesn't matter what sort of cognitive capacities they have. It doesn't matter if they have theory of mind or not. It doesn't matter what kind of memory they have. But these are individual persons with their own interests and cares and relationships. And if we treat them as if they are things, objects, like a chair to buy and sell and do with what we want, we're committing a real moral hazard. So I wish that, I see that the legal system is moving. Like one of the justices said, it is clear to me that chimpanzees are not things. I'm not sure if they're persons. Maybe we need a third category. That's a shift, right? That's a shift in the right direction. And we just need to continue putting pressure on the legal establishment, and also educating people more generally about animals, and also educating people in these kind of first person experiences. I think that the nature documentaries are great, but also paying attention to the animals in their own backyard. Right, Lisa, when you were talking about, we take for granted the macaques when we're living in India and they're all around us. In Borneo, people told me they took for granted the orangutans too. They're like, oh yeah, those pests, they raid my fruit garden. Um, in Toronto, we take for granted the rats because they're everywhere. They're also pests. But
Actually,
we
can
can
you
look at
please,
the
since we are
rats
about
too.
rats, rats are us is amazing. The name of your article was interesting. So Lisa was talking about experiments on animals and especially macaques and more like focused on primates. But then like, there are more animals and they all have sentience, and like we will come to this like consciousness, sentience and cognition, all these names, but like they're all beings, right? Like even just understanding they're all beings. And
That's right.
even if we don't go into all those details, so rats are us is the article you wrote. I just like the
That's
name. And so you are bringing attention to that. And actually, Mark, I would like to invite you to this because I was hearing one of your talks and you were talking about how the Animal Welfare Act, what they say about rats, and you were like sounding very like, kind of, how is this possible? Can you say a little bit about that?
Um, what's your question? What do you?
You were talking about the rats not being included, right, as animals in the Animal
Oh
Welfare
yeah,
Act.
well, yeah, the Animal Welfare Act in the United States redefined the word animals to exclude rats, mice, birds, fishes, other insects, and I mean, it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. I mean, a lot of my smart scientist friends are really totally uninformed. I mean, this discussion that Kristen and Lisa have been having with you, I mean, and they're chickens. I mean, one of the things I learned as a grad student working with a guy named Michael Fox, he was a canid carnivore expert, was there's no line between, if you will, scholar, academic, and advocate, activist, if you will. And just to make a side note, because I've been working really hard, um, I mean, literally this morning on the fate of the new wolves who were reintroduced to Colorado. We brought them here, we dumped them out, and then people just allow them to be killed, or Colorado Parks and Wildlife kills them. So there's a big difference between being an advocate and an activist. Of course, the word, and I always say that I'm not an animal rights activist, I'm an animal protection activist because the phrase animal rights activist has all these negative connotations, as does the word activist. But yeah, I mean, it shocks me that where are my colleagues? And I mean, I'm really open about it because I have nothing to lose. I mean, none of us has anything to lose by speaking out for non-human animals and their rights and welfare. But it's the dumbest thing I ever heard in my life. That, I mean, they've redefined the word animal. And the reason they've done this is it allows them to torture animals and do horrible things to animals in the name of science. I mean, that's just my view of it. Um, and each revision, I'm thinking, oh, maybe they're going to change it and they're going to actually recognize that rats and mice and all these other animals are animals. And I mean, I do a lot of work with Jane's Roots and Shoots groups and other kids groups, and these come up all the time where, 8-year-olds will say, well, how come rats aren't animals? Of course they're animals. They'll say, I have a pet rat who I love.
Yeah.
So that's an area where um, I don't know. We really need a lot of work, but it's mostly because so many of my colleagues are just I call them chickens. I don't like calling them that. They'll tell you over a beer that it's the dumbest thing they've ever seen, and then when they speak out, or they don't speak out, you know. Um, I think that's changing. Jane and I actually talked about this last year when we were writing something. Um, it's changing. I think more and more people are coming out, if you will, and saying, number one, it's wrong. And number two, the argument that I really like that seems to attract more and more scientists is that the quality of the data that are collected
Mhm.
it's just horrible. I work on dogs and there's all these studies of dogs, but I'm really a field worker. And people don't realize that a lot of the data that come out of field studies, there's a woman named Gisela Kaplan in Australia who's been writing details about a methodology of studying wild birds. And since I'm a field worker, I always say, well, no, you should be retitling your paper The Behavior of Stressed Wild Birds. It's not the normal behavior. So I think one argument that I think is getting a little more purchase is that the quality of the data are really compromised. And in the lab, obviously they are. I mean, you've got these
Yeah.
animals, they're prisoners, right? And I've had leading primate researchers confidentially tell me that they don't believe a lot of the data. It's called ecological validity. They don't believe a lot of the data have anything to do other than for the 10 marmosets or 10 chimpanzees or 10, monkeys in that lab. And it's the same in dog research, by the way.
Well,
So,
Mark, I wanted to tell you that right now we've got in Ajanta, India, a team of scientists who are studying free-ranging dogs and
mhm,
that live in the village.
yeah.
And we've got drones flying over them, so it's non-invasive. We're looking at the natural behavior. We're looking at the interaction that the dogs naturally have with people of this village. It's the village of the other PI on the project, Kulu Suryawanshi, who's
Hmm.
based in Bangalore. And Julia Espinoza
Hmm.
who's you probably know, is my postdoc who's working on this project. So I think that there is a lot of change in the science now, that scientists are really excited about looking at cognitive capacity. We're looking at social norms in these dogs, right? So we're looking at this anthropological
Right.
and cognitive and affective abilities of dogs in these free-ranging contexts. I think things are changing a lot from the scientists I've been interacting with, and the willingness to acknowledge consciousness and sentience as well. That is completely changing, has changed in the last
I,
25 years.
I think you're a little more optimistic than I am with the rapidity of the change. Yeah, I have a student who just finished months in India studying not only dog-dog interactions, the formation and the breaking up of dog packs, but also the
Mm.
public health aspect, because that's where the money is. Nobody really cares, if you can't turn it into that. Yeah, I mean, that's just really, getting back to that stupid definition of animals in the Animal Welfare Act. Where are they? But I think I agree with you that more. I don't want to say more and more. There's only a handful of scientists, John Gluck, for examples, and others who have been active researchers who just say, no, not only is there an ethical dimension of how these animals are brutalized. I mean, they are brutalized. Let's not, sitting in a cage getting your favorite cookie or whatever is not animal welfare or animal well-being. It's a way for the scientists to kind of deal with their own guilt, if you
So,
will. But it's the quality of data. I mean, because I'm a field worker, I look at data that come from other studies of carnivores, wolves, and coyotes, for example. But the dog work, I have people tell me, well, dogs don't do that. And I'm thinking, God, I was just at the local dog park. I saw it 100 times. I think one thing that I think is relevant to this conversation, and Jane and I really had a lot of talks about it, was that people are no longer worried about, quote, being anthropomorphic. That's just a sideshow when you start, people say, well, you're just being anthropomorphic. So you spend days arguing that you're not, when you could be collecting data that just show that you're not being anthropomorphic. Franz de Waal wrote, I mean, some really good papers about anthropodenial. But anyway, I mean, getting back to Jane, I mean, these were things that we talked about when we traveled in person over scotch and writing for decades, And once again, I'm getting back to what she did in the 60 something years ago was just opening the door to talking about individuality and personalities and recognizing the value of each and every individual. And that's really the basis of compassionate conservation. You just can't go out and kill animals because there's a million rats. So if you kill 1,000 of them, it doesn't matter because unless you're one of the thousand rats. But the reason I mention this with respect to Jane is she didn't speak out a lot about some of these early on, but over the last couple of years, because I was the ethics committee for the Jane Goodall Institute, and then we have a co-chair and we have an ethics committee. We put out a lot of declarations and proclamations, no holds barred. There's no shade of gray here. I mean, I really believe that. You just have to say, this is wrong. And I know philosophers will sometimes disagree. And mentioning Lori, I just had the pleasure of working on a paper with her on do animals have a sense of humor? I think you know that.
Yes, I know that paper.
So anyway, yeah. Anyway, I could go on and on. It's time for a paradigm shift. Y'all are doing it, of course, but the time has come. No more BS. No more shades of gray. It is simply wrong to do certain things, and we have to stop doing them today. And I understand labs might close and people might have to switch their research, but it is wrong. And that's it, 100% wrong. And I can tell you that Jane and I talked about this as recently as last summer when we were working on our kids' book on other things, and it wasn't because she was afraid of talking about it, but over time, she wrote a great article last year about ending factory farming. Just, it's done.
Yeah,
I
so
mean,
Joyce, maybe we will come
anyway,
back to that
yeah,
once
I'm trying to
we
lead
talk to
Joyce, and I want to hear
Yeah, no,
from
no,
you.
no, it's amazing. I mean, it's so wonderful to bring Jane alive and like know all these conversations. I mean, you've had so many conversations with her. You really can bring her presence into this room. And yeah, so just, I mean, rats, I think, Kristen, what you were writing, like there is this thing, right? Like, there are all this animal research from what I've been reading. It's like there's this interesting perspective where they're close enough to us to actually try to do research on them. Like, can you say it maybe, Kristen? The way, because there was this really poignant sentence in your article about it.
Yeah, I mean, when we were doing the research on primates, on chimpanzees and monkeys, the arguments were, well, they're similar enough to us to be able to find out about human mental illness by creating mentally ill primates and then testing different drugs or interventions on them to try to cure mental illness. But there was no concern for a while about the morality of doing this to primates. John Gluck wrote a very, very good book about that research and his transition. But the thing is, now that we've ended doing that research on chimpanzees, we're still doing that research on other species.
Right.
We're doing it on macaques, we're doing it on rats. And the article that Susanna Monceau and I wrote that you can find freely available on Aon, you Google Rats or Us, is that rats are as similar enough to us that scientists are using them as a model for humans, and yet they do not even get qualified as an animal under Animal Protection Act in the United States. Mm-hmm. That any sort of ethical protection for rats is all done at the institutional level. And I wrote this article because of research I had done with rats that I ended up regretting very much doing. Because my idea, it's the first time I had ever done any kind of research like this, was that we could then adopt out the rats after the experiment. It was a social learning experiment. It should have been fine. But the institution didn't give us permission to do that. And instead they euthanized 50 rats. And so when they told me they had to do that, I researched what was thought to be the best practices in euthanizing rats. And I asked them if we could do it that way. And they told me no, we're going to gas them, even though gassing causes immense suffering. And so I couldn't sleep. I was very, very distraught. And so the least I could do was write this for the rats. Those rats, was 50 rats, but also all the other rats that suffer the same fate. Mm-hmm. And I also now I just feed the rats in my backyard. And we try to figure out how to coexist in the city of Toronto. They're doing a lot of construction right around the corner, digging up foundations for huge buildings. So the rats are all coming up because their homes have been destroyed. And then the city is now saying, oh, we need to have a rat guru. We need to have a big policy about what to do with rats. Um, but I think what we need to do is re-examine our relationship with the animals in the city, including the coyotes that have been moving into the city, and think about how we can coexist. What are the social norms that do exist between humans and the rats, the coyotes, the squirrels, the pigeons, how we can think about changing these sorts of practices, these rules and conventions that have been established to make it work better for all of us. Um, this is we need this kind of a shift of mindset and think about other animals that we live with as individuals and societies we can negotiate with, as opposed to just a problem or individuals that we can just get rid of. Negotiation, I think, and recognition of the importance of the societies that the animals are creating and that we're part of their society is essential.
There was just an interesting comment that came up about the use of the word euthanasia. And I think it's a really important one because I'm not a fan of zoos. There are good and better zoos, but a good zoo doesn't necessarily mean that it takes care of the animals. And I've had that same argument because people don't know, especially in Europe. It doesn't happen that much, I think, in Canada and the United States. They kill healthy animals like Marius the giraffe. And recently in University in Ireland killed an entire wolf pack. So they say they euthanize them. And one day I was out with my dog Jethro, and I had great discussions with him. And Jethro and I came up with the word zoothanasia. That's really caught on because that's what it is. And I really stress that because I really appreciate the comment that just sailed onto my screen. Because in Colorado, they euthanized a wolf who was just being a wolf. No, they murdered them. And some of you may know the work of Pierce Byrne in Maine. I mean, it's okay. They'll say, well, under the law, animals can't be murdered. And I'm thinking, what the hell does that mean? I mean, they can't be murdered. They are being murdered. Simple.
This is why personhood is so important. Legal personhood is so important.
That's where I was coming back to exactly. You can't do, you don't do, you do necropsies on animals. You can't use the word that we use for humans, autopsies. I mean, I just had an argument with some guy. I know he's got a particle of a brain. I mean, somewhere he's got a brain that is working. And he said, well, no, we don't do autopsies on animals. We do necropsies. So, I mean, I don't have time for that kind of junk anymore in my life. And I said, well, would you like to explain the difference? And after he mumbled for a minute, I realized that he had no idea what he was talking about. But the personhood, which we can come back to maybe later.
Yeah, but
is
sorry,
a unifying principle. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, interrupt, but I just wanted to bring the cow into the room because
yes,
so I think
we've
been talking about all the animals, but we have not yet come to all the animals. So Joyce, could you please illuminate us with all the life's work that you have done with the animals that are, Mark just mentioned factory farming. And so I just wanted for us to kind of come to those animals that we have not yet touched upon, which are really everywhere. Yes.
Well, at the moment, we slaughter over 80 billion farmed animals every year and trillions of fishes, all just for our food. And so we're talking numbers of animals that we're controlling their lives and their deaths. The numbers are vast. And I'm reminded of a conference we put on at Compassion and Well Farming in 2005. And Jane was the keynote speaker. And she said, humans are unique. Chimpanzees are unique. Elephants are unique. And pigs are unique. And I thought, good for you, Jane, bring the farm animals in, because I know she's associated with her wonderful work on primates, chimps, and so on, but she became very concerned about farm animals. And she appeared on a couple of campaign videos for us, lobbying the European Union. And she was very, very strong indeed. And she even started speaking about diet. And one thing she said was we should eat less meat or no meat and turn to plant-based diets. And it's funny, if I go back to my own life, I grew up on a farm in Ireland, and our neighbor was a sheep farmer, and one of his ewes had triplets, and she couldn't cope. So this neighbor offered one of the lambs as a temporary pet to my brother and myself. And we took very good care of Patrick, gave him his bottle at all the right times, etc. And he had, I think, quite a good life with us. And I was interested in Mark saying about a sense of humor, because I swear Patrick had a sense of humor. And one day it was a really warm spring day and the front door was open and he wandered into the house. And when we eventually wandered in after him, he'd taken some books off a low bookshelf and was kind of messing about with them and chewing them and so on. And he looked at us when we came in and he was kind of a little bit worried. And you could just see he was kind of amused and worried, and he knew he shouldn't have done it. And he was waiting to see what we'd do. And I swear he had a sense of humor. And sadly, we did know he was temporary. At about 6 months old, he went back to the farm he came from. And yeah, I was 5 and my brother was 7. And we were told, well, you know, his mummy will see him and they'll be happy to meet up again. But when he'd gone, my big sister was about 10 years older than me. She said, you don't really believe that, do you, Joyce? His mother won't recognize him. And you'd probably eat him for lunch on Sunday. And on Sunday, we had lamb for lunch. And my father, who is a big believer in meat, wanted me to eat my meat. And I was pushing the meat to the side of my plate and not eating it. And he said, eat your meat, Joyce. And I said, but it might be Patrick. And he said, you have to eat your meat. So I did. But I think that was actually my personal trigger for ending up working for farm animals. And on the way, reading Gandhi's wonderful autobiography, which made me a vegetarian. And then a BBC Two documentary in 1975 about the life of a dairy cow. And I saw the calf being taken away and bellowing his head off, and the mother cow running up and down the field trying to get out after her calf. And I thought, soy milk tomorrow. And actually in 1975, it was very difficult to find soy milk, but things have changed. It's now very easy. And of course, Jane went on that dietary journey herself and ended up as a vegan and wrote her meatless book. So it's interesting how we all travel our different paths and come up with maybe similar conclusions. And I know in 2023, Compassion About Farming, who I've worked with for many years, put on a conference and Jane couldn't actually be there, but she sent us a film. And she said, each animal can feel depression, fear, and pain. And that was really what triggered our whole work around animal sentience, which we continue to this day. But I'd only been a compassion for about 3 years in 1988, when our founder, an amazing man called Peter Roberts, lifted up the treaty of the European Union, which was called the Treaty of Rome. And he said, look at this, animals are listed as goods or products. We've got to get this changed. We've got to get them recognized as sentient beings. And, you know, it was 1988. There were 7 of us working for Compassion in a little market town in the south of England. Yeah, we were going to change the European Treaty. And we did. It took 9 years and the cooperation of many groups all over Europe. We started a petition. We wrote to all these groups, said, would you please translate this into your own language and get signatures? And within 3 years, we had 1 million signatures. And of course, in those days, you signed a piece of paper. So how did you get signatures? You stood out in the rain on a Saturday morning and stopped the passers-by and said, would you sign this? And people did. So we took our million signatures to the European Parliament and we gave them in, and eventually it took 3 years, but the Parliament endorsed the petition. But that still didn't mean it was going to be the law. So we had to get a government to kind of introduce it at government level. And so we were lobbying hard, the government in the UK, but they didn't really want to know. I remember meeting a minister, I won't say who it was, but he said, oh, well, my wife is Spanish and she loves bullfighting. And I thought, what am I doing meeting you? So we weren't going to get anywhere with him. But we were very lucky. We lobbied the opposition, and I would say strategically lobbied the opposition as well, because they got in. So the Labour Party got in under Tony Blair. I know there are all sorts of things we could say about Tony Blair, but actually he did this one very good thing. And because we'd lobbied his party, he was under pressure from the people we'd lobbied to bring this issue forward. 6 weeks after he was elected as Prime Minister, there was this huge meeting of all the countries, all the prime ministers of the European Union in Amsterdam. So we had a big demonstration in Amsterdam with people from all over Europe, with all their placards in different languages saying animals are sentient beings. And amazingly, they attached a protocol to the treaty recognizing animals as sentient beings. And 10 years later, there was another similar meeting in Portugal, and it was called the Treaty of Lisbon. These are sort of regular updates of the European Treaty. And they actually made it an article in the treaty, Article 13. So animals are recognized as sentient beings, and the European Union itself and the member states all have to pay full regard to the welfare of animals when they make laws concerning them. And the final thing just about that is, obviously, as you know, sadly, Britain left the European Union, the dreadful Brexit, sorry to sound a bit political, but we actually lost that power of that European law when we left the European Union. And it's taken quite a long time, but we have at last got the UK government to bring in an Animal Sentience Act, and that establishes an Animal Sentience Committee, and it also recognizes that, unlike the American law, not only all these mammals are sentient, but it includes lobsters, octopuses, and so on. They're all covered in this act. So they're all recognized as sentient beings, which is great. So we need to get that all over the world. And it's beginning to happen. You know, New Zealand, Chile, Colombia, they've all recognized animals as sentient beings. And you could say, well, that doesn't ban any cages or get pigs out of gestation crates. No, it doesn't. But it changes the ground on which we make the argument. Because if animals are sentient beings and they are legally recognized as such, then how can you keep hens in a cage? How can you keep pregnant pigs unable to turn around? It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Thank you. And so, I mean, there was this conference, Darwin to Dawkins, that you organized, and about animal sentience. And then you also had lots of conferences organized about regenerative and food systems. So you've worked a lot on food systems and animals and how but like, so what is the biggest challenge you are seeing right now to change the status quo in terms of, like, you know, once you recognize them as animals, like animals are sentient, and as you said, all these other animals are included. And I think that brings us also to what Kristen has done with her colleagues, this New York Declaration of Animal Consciousness. Kristen, would you like to just say a little bit about that and how that can be connected to what Joyce has been saying?
Yeah, sure. I also just want to add that Canada is one of those countries. I'm in Toronto right now. Canada is one of those countries who hasn't yet declared animals sentient. But our MP, Elizabeth May, has introduced a petition that we've been working hard on. So maybe the government of Canada will also declare animals as sentient. But yeah, so the New York Declaration of Animal Consciousness was our. I did this work with Jonathan Birch, who was one of the people in the UK who was working on establishing sentience of octopuses and lobsters and crabs and so on, and Jeff Sebo at NYU, and we decided that it was time to really make an announcement and see what this progress has been that I was gesturing to before over the last 25 years in acceptances among scientists in the sentience or consciousness of non-human animals. And maybe it will help to clarify what the difference is between those words, sentience and consciousness.
Yeah.
They're a little bit tricky, but by sentience, we just mean the ability to feel something, like feeling pain or pleasure, feeling hunger or thirst, feeling care and concern. Whereas consciousness is a larger term that includes sentience, that might also include like self-reflection or inner speech, making decisions, and so on. And so with consciousness, when we say these animals are conscious, sentience is sufficient, establishing sentience is sufficient for them being conscious. And the sort of work that we've been looking at is work on animals who are also invertebrate animals. So the octopuses and other mollusks, the other crabs and crustaceans, and also the insects. And also looking at vertebrates that don't get as much attention, and that people have been in the past more concerned about their consciousness, like fish or birds, because their brains are different from humans. So many of the arguments for consciousness is very anthropomorphic, anthropocentric, that starts with us. We know we're conscious. How do we know we're conscious? There is this philosophical problem of other minds. It's never been solved. We still have it. Science hasn't solved it. But we infer consciousness in other humans because of how humans act. But then if you start looking at the brains of humans and say, how similar are the brains of fish or birds to human brains, and use that as your criteria, you've completely shifted the question, because we don't know what about human brains make us conscious. We have no idea. We know they have to be alive, basically. Um,
Well, that's also
but
not clear as it. So there are all sorts of theories of consciousness where, like, even it's not clear whether the life is necessary, right? That it might be just
it's
there on the
true.
background.
It's
And so
true.
it's such an unknown that we don't really understand. So to the extent that we understand consciousness, I mean, as you were
It's
saying, it's very much now when it comes to animal consciousness, like you start making all these things, we don't understand it for ourselves, right?
right.
So,
So we can't look at the way the
yeah.
neurophysiology, because none of the neurophysiological theories of consciousness are well supported. And the first person to tell you that would be the people who are working in the neuroscience of consciousness. And this is why they have adversarial research programs going on, because they're trying to figure out
Yeah.
if any of these theories are correct. What we do have is the same thing we have for.
Um, I think,
I think she's gone.
yeah, something is frozen. So perhaps maybe we should continue with the conversation. So, Mark, I was actually going to um, ask maybe Jessica, maybe can you, yeah, spotlight, because I think Christine seems to be, yeah. So, Mark, you have written quite a bit about the spirituality that animals,
Yeah.
whether they're, and I think Jane has written about primate spirituality, right? So, can you, at this point, maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I saw a question that, or a comment that somebody named Jeff made. Um, yeah, I mean, Jane had a very strong spiritual life. A lot of it came to the four in her book, Reasons for Hope.
Right.
And, at the time,
I have this here. Yeah.
she was very concerned. She was somewhat concerned, but a lot of people were concerned that it was fluff, and that, you can't really talk about that kind of stuff. And living in Boulder, Colorado, I told, and when we would get together, I said, yeah, Boulder's full of spirituality and crystals and all the fluff. But in a serious way, um, she really had a very strong spiritual life and spiritual proclivities. I mean, in her work, she wrote about the waterfall dances,
Yeah.
chimpanzees using, very strong language. I mean, I don't mean strong in a bad way, but language about whether they're precursors of religious beliefs and all that. So yeah, and I really enjoyed talking to her about that. We at a meeting at the Whitby Institute, it was soon after her mother passed away, and my mother was not doing well. We talked for hours on end in the chapel there about animal spirituality and also the role of our mothers in our lives. They were very powerful. And on the ground, Jane and I spent about a week in Barcelona, and we went to the Mona primate sanctuary outside of Girona, Spain. And that was about as close to a chimpanzee as I've been. I mean, I've seen them in zoos when I was young, but this was a rescue sanctuary. And there was a chimpanzee named Marco there who would just go into a trance when there were thunderstorms. So Jane and I, the weather was turning bad, and I guess maybe we were both hoping that there would be a thunderstorm. A thunderstorm came, and there was Marco. I mean, if you saw it, it would be really hard to deny that he wasn't having some, if you will, extra body, extra corporeal, some kind of experience that could only be explained in the spiritual realm. But he just went into like a trance. And Jane and I were just talking about him. Of course, it was very similar to what she had observed in the wild with these waterfall dances. So yeah, she had a um, strong spiritual proclivities, and I love the way that over time she was just much more overt about that aspect of her life. It was very, needless to say, it was very important to her. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that her spiritual awareness seems like was the guiding light in all her work, and she writes really, it's really amazing to read her book about that, the reason for hope, a spiritual journey, and like once we bring in that animals also have spirituality, consciousness, and spirituality, and there's really like very hard to start drawing lines, and that's why I want to come back to this expansive space that we started our conversation in.
Hmm.
And and then like there are so many philosophies from spiritual traditions which talk about rebirth and like all animals, like the cycle of life and death. And so it all kind of science and spirituality, when it comes down to very fundamental questions, they start coming together. And so there is this, because you say like, may all beings everywhere be happy and free, and like may all beings be liberated, right? And so that means that all animals may have the capacity to be liberated, like going through the cycle of life and death, right? So there is
Hmm.
all this, in lots of ancient traditions, it's there. And now like it's science is kind of coming together, and like because it has to, because both of this science and spirituality are asking a very fundamental question, and it cannot be like different answers
Yeah, I mean,
at
I
that
mean,
level.
right after her book was published, Jane and I were part of a program called Science and the Spiritual Quest, and we spent almost a week in Paris with theologians, religious scholars, hardcore neuroscientists, and if nothing else, I think it really firmed up, if you will, her beliefs and mine as well, that there's really something there. So you're totally correct that we just really need to expand our horizons into the I mean, I don't know. I guess you could cash it out as the cognitive and emotional capacities of animals. I don't think we have to make it academic. I mean, what's so weird about thinking that chimpanzees and other animals have spiritual lives of their kind? And that was another thing, really important in the study of animal behavior and ethology that I shared with Jane was just getting into the lives of these animals themselves. We don't have to use humans as a template. I mean, I get lost in discussions of consciousness, but I don't think we need to worry about how similar our neuroanatomy or neurophysiology is to those of non-human animals. They
Yeah.
can have their own sense of consciousness, or what it means to be a conscious dog or ant
Right.
or lobster be waiting to be sensing something's going on and waiting to be dropped into a pot of boiling water. So I think that in some ways, and I know I've got some really hardcore philosophers here who are a lot brighter than I am, like Kristen, but it's really speciesist to use ourselves as the template against whom every other animal will be measured. I mean, I've spent enough time in the field, thousands of hours watching animals. There's a coyote consciousness, there's a wolf consciousness. There's you just when you watch these animals, watch dogs at a dog park, I just don't see any reason why we can't argue that they're not going in, argue against that they're going into a realm to which we may not have access. Big deal, you
Yeah.
know? It's who they are. And I also think about that of watching animals in labs suffer. We cannot, I don't think we can have any good feeling other than coming up with different markers of suffering, self-rocking, self-destruction, stereotype pacing of what these animals are really going through. And I think we can use ourselves to put ourselves in those situations to understand how difficult it must be for the animals. I just don't think that I personally could go into that realm and really, if you will, grok it. I love the word grok from Robert Heinlein's book, Stranger in a Strange Land, what they're going through. And I feel very comfortable saying that Jane would agree with what I just said.
Yeah.
I mean, people, her
Joyce,
mind.
yeah. Yeah, so I'm just saying Joyce actually has written a book. Joyce, can you say a few words about your book? I know we are kind of at the time already, but
Oh
like,
yeah, a wonderful book. I interviewed Joyce about it. No,
yeah.
it's a great
So
book.
you bring all the religions there
Yep.
and all the philosophies and
Well, in the book, I was looking at all the major faiths and some minor ones
yeah,
and seeing what they teach about our relationship with animals. And it's really interesting because in different ways, they all recognize that animals are special in some way. I mean, in Islam, the Quran says animals are communities like yourselves. There's a lovely quote from one of the Chinese philosophers, Mengzi, who said that once someone has heard the cries of the animals, he cannot bear to eat their flesh. And Pope Francis, towards the end of his life, he said we must respect the particular goodness of every creature. And, there's so much in Hinduism and Buddhism about, you know, the divine being in each animal.
and
And
Jain philosophy is all
yeah,
about
yeah,
ahimsa.
yeah. I mean, the sad thing is that there's all this lovely teaching, and they say that about 80% of the world's population do say they belong to a certain faith. But the world is full of factory farms, laboratories, zoos, circuses, etc. So it's like the religious leaders aren't perhaps doing their job,
Hmm.
and the faith followers have forgotten what the teaching is. So I would say I would challenge faith leaders, read your own books and perhaps the holy books of other faiths, and take on board, the fact that animals are individual beings, they can suffer, and it's up to us in our relationship with them to, first of all, let them be, and secondly, try to make their lives as good as they possibly can be, as we should do with our own species, obviously, as well.
Yeah, I just want to chime in and agree, Joyce, that in the history of not just religious thinking, but also philosophical thinking, philosophers around the world, global philosophers, spoke about animals as feeling beings, that they have minds, they have consciousness. Like this was just taken for granted for many, many years. And it seems like there was something that happened in the 20th century that where some people forgot, some Western educated
Behaviorism.
people forgot.
Mm.
But now we should remember, and we can read those old texts and find them. And this is how I started my talk in the New York Declaration of Animal Consciousness. That when Descartes presented his argument, his view that animals don't have conscious minds, he was met with abhorrence from the philosophical community, outrage. People thought that was absolutely ridiculous and absurd. So we need to remember that history too, that the intellectual history is on the side of animals.
No, that's really important. I know we're probably getting to the end, so I was just going to offer two things about Jane, if that's okay.
Yeah,
Um,
actually, I mean, we are past time, but I think this is so precious that I would love to just
I'll
bring
just
it to a closure, bring it to the closure as it needs to be. So I would love to hear about Jane, what you were
well,
going to say.
Jane's favorite animals were dogs. You know,
Yes,
she
I
said
know.
that
I had to keep a dog because, and she used to carry all this the animal with her. So I today
Yes, she
actually kept
carried
all these animals here.
Mr. H was a monkey, and people would say, "Oh, what a chimpanzee!" And Jane would always respond, "No, no, monkeys have tails, chimpanzees don't." Um, but the reason I mention that is something that Jane and I had talked about, and it's not going to be new to some of you people, is that because of my work with dogs, I always use dogs to bring home messages about animal well-being, animal rights. And the question I ask, would you do it to your dog? And the reason I do that, I think of dogs as what I call a gateway species for bridging the empathy gap. And it's really worked. I actually, on the ground, because I'm a field worker, on the ground in Colorado, when I started asking people who want to kill wolves, for example, or have killed wolves, would you do it to your dog? That was, that was just really, they had not thought about it that way. Okay, so because a lot of the academic arguments that we use, I mean, they're really sound, but most people on the ground don't need to hear about sustainability and biodiversity and even animal rights. But when you really bring it down, and I don't mean down in a pejorative way, but you bring it down to everyday talk and you start using examples, and I think Joyce has done this really well. You're talking about, pigs on a plate, for example. I think that's really important. And then a question came up, and I might as well just tell you that our kids' book will be out in February 2027. Somebody just asked that question.
Yeah.
And it's about a baby elephant. And,
Um,
maybe by the next time we get together, I can share the
yeah,
cover.
maybe when the last panel we are going to talk
Yeah.
about it.
By
So,
that time, I think I can share it. It's really, no, I'm just being really honest. I mean,
yeah.
I would do it right now. I've got the
Yeah,
proofs
I
right
know, but
here.
let's just wait for the final
Yes.
panel for that. And I just like in the last 1 or 2 minutes, just wanted to also say that Lisa, I'm really looking forward to watching Sentient. I don't know when is it going to be released, so I don't know if all other panelists and the audience are aware, but there is a movie called Sentient that was featured in Sundance Festival, and actually
Actually,
chronicles
it'll
the
be up
story of Lisa.
in Toronto,
Hot
Kristen.
dogs.
Just it's coming up at Hot Docs soon. But it's no, this was a documentary that looked at it. It had some undercover footage inside primate facilities, actually in the UK, as well as facilities at my own former primate center. But the thread throughout this is, what does it cost people when they do primate experimentation, when they do experimentation? What, for me, this I didn't quite when the documentary folks approached me 4 years ago, I thought this was going to be about the primate trade and primate experimentation, and so I jumped in and I followed that through. But in the end, it turned out more of the call for empathy. Empathy is not just for the animals, but also empathy for the people whose lives are shaped by those animals. And I think that it's going to have a profound effect. It should be released later on this year. Right now, it's on the festival circuit. But that makes me think about this one question that was asked a few minutes ago, and the person was saying, are any of you doing anything about intergenerational gaps in the field of science and activism? And that got me really thinking about, so when I left academia, I was at the top of my career. And I told a few of my colleagues, and the response was very mixed. One of them in particular said, PETA? You're going to PETA? And I said, yeah. And then a few months later, I got an email from this man, a fabulous colleague, an outstanding scientist. We'd worked together for years. And I thought, here it comes. I'm gonna get beaten down because I've jumped into the activist world. And what he said, I think, speaks to what Jane started. He said, Lisa, I know you as a scientist. I know you are a very good scientist. And if you've gone to PETA, that means that I can no longer dismiss PETA, because you've found value in what that group is doing. Therefore, I have to reassess. And I think that's what Jane did for the world.
Mm-hmm.
She forced the world to reassess, whether it's another scientist looking at me working as an animal activist, whether it was just, each and every one of us reassessing what is our relationship to the animals in our home, to the animals in our field studies, to the animals on our plates. She has forced us to reckon with that, and that the reckoning is, the moment is now. I know, Mark, you think that you're not quite as optimistic as we are. We are so close. We are so close. So I thank Jane for that.
Yeah, I think what you just said is really true about the word. I love the word reassessment. It just sit down and think about it,
Yeah.
And so I really am a card-carrying optimist, but sometimes I see things and I go, "Oh gosh, this is just terrible." But I am, and I think we are. We're all impatient. Well, I shouldn't say we all are. I'm impatient. I mean,
Me too.
this stuff is just staring people in the face. But among my friends, I've got people, because I'm a cyclist, I used to race bikes, that more and more are becoming vegetarian. More and more are paying closer attention to the way they care for their dog or cat or companion animal. So I see it there, but sometimes I just, you just see what's going on. You go,
Yeah.
oh man, this is just bad news. Anyway,
So
thank you.
let's maybe all just join together and in prayer to bring a closure. And in this expansive space that we were having this conversation, I invite everyone again to just connect to that space. And as I said, Jane would say that we are all here together for a reason. And to just connect to all the life, all the animals, all beings everywhere. And let's ask for forgiveness for all that we as humans have done to non-human animals for so long. And as we were just hearing, hopefully it will shift soon. But let's ask for forgiveness. And I invite you to join me in that. And maybe if we forgive with all our hearts, maybe we will really come close to ending this. So let's ask forgiveness for all the harm we have caused as humans. And then At the same time, let's pray that may all beings everywhere be happy and free. And may the thoughts, words, and actions of our lives contribute to that happiness and freedom for all. And may all beings be liberated. So with that prayer, I would like to thank all of you who have joined us in this expansive space, and thank you so much, all the amazing panelists. And Christy Rootman, like I know you are not, I think you're not here, but I know you are going to weave this together in the last panel. Thank you. And thank you, Parliament of the World's Religions, for hosting this and this program, and the Women Task Force for all the support, and the communications team, and Jessica, who is taking care of all the technicalities. And with all that gratitude for everyone, I just want to say thank you and look forward to the next panel. Hopefully all of you will join us at the next panel too. And I think the links are all alive, so please register for the next panels. Thank you. And thank you all
Thank you very
life,
much.
all animals who have given us so much love. I'm sure all of us have experienced a lot of love from from our from non-human animals, and just everywhere they're there. And so hopefully in this expansive space we will keep meeting them and feeling them, thinking about them differently. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Blessings.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.